The east wing of Ashcombe Hall had been closed for 11 years, and Nora Pruitt was the only servant in the house permitted to dust it. She learned this on her third morning, when the housekeeper handed her a heavy iron key worn smooth at the bit, and told her that no one else went in, that no one else was to know she went in, and that whatever she found beyond the double doors was none of her concern. The corridor smelled of cold plaster, and something older underneath it, a sweetness gone to dust. Nora turned the key. The lock gave with a sound like a held breath released, and the sealed room opened before her, and on the far wall above a marble hearth swept clean of ashes from more than a decade, hung a portrait of a woman in a pale green gown, and on the woman's slender hand there was a ring Nora had seen that very morning on the hand of the master of the house. She stood very still. The candle trembled a little in her fingers, though the air in the room was without a draught. She had polished that ring not 2 hours before, in the gallery where the Earl of Ashcombe took his coffee, and did not look at the girl who cleaned the grate. A signet ring, gold gone soft at the edges with age, carved with the head of a stag turned to face its own shoulder. She had thought it only a gentleman's ornament. Now it hung on a painted hand in a room no one entered, and the woman who wore it in the portrait was smiling at something outside the frame, and she was young, and she was gone. You will want to know what a chambermaid was doing with a key to a room the whole household feared. So did she. The wanting was a private thing that morning, and Nora had learned, in the 4 years since her father's death had emptied the small living he left her, to keep her private things folded small and out of sight. Nora had come to Ashcombe by way of a widow's letter and a coach that broke its axle twice on the northern road. She was 23, which the world had already decided was a year too many for a woman with no dowry and no family to speak of, and she had accepted the position of chambermaid because a governess must have references, and a chambermaid needed only strong hands and a closed mouth. Her hands were strong, her mouth she had trained herself. What she had not trained and could not was the habit of noticing the thing her father, the schoolmaster, had put into her before the fever took him, the way of looking at a room until the room gave up what it was hiding. The portrait gave up nothing that first morning but the ring. Nora dusted the frame with a cloth she wrung dry, careful not to touch the paint, and she did not let herself study the woman's face, because studying was the beginning of caring, and caring was a thing a chambermaid could not afford. She swept the hearth that held no fire. She wiped the tall windows whose curtains had been drawn against the light so long the velvet had faded in stripes. And when she left, she locked the door behind her and hung the key on the ring at her waist beneath her apron, where no one would see it, and she went down to the kitchen and ate her bread and did not speak. The Earl of Ashcombe was named Julian Hartwell, and the house said of him what houses say of men who do not smile, that he was cold, that he had been cold since before the servants who served him now had come to the place, so that his coldness had passed from a thing that happened into a thing that simply was, like the closed east wing, like the drawn curtains, like the 11 silent ears. The underfootman said it first. The day Nora arrived, leaning against the scullery door with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong about anything easy. "He is a cold one," the footman said, "and you would do well to stay out of his sight, for he has no more use for a girl's face than he has for the sun." Nora had said nothing. She had only marked the word cold and set it aside, because she had learned that the words a house used most were the words it understood least. She saw the Earl the next morning in the gallery, as she saw him most mornings after, a tall man with dark hair going grey at the temple, though he could not have been past 32, his coat a deep and perfect navy, his cravat white and exact, his jaw set as though against a wind no one else could feel. He did not look at her. He looked at the window, or at the long row of portraits down the gallery wall, or at nothing at all, and he drank his coffee and left, and the signet ring caught the light when he set the cup down, the stag turning forever to face its own shoulder. Nora cleaned the grate on her knees and did not look at him, and the not looking was its own kind of attention, the way a still pond attends to everything that passes over it. What she did not yet understand was that the room she dusted in secret was the reason the house had a shape at all, and that the shape was grief, and that grief given 11 years and a locked door, hardens into something almost indistinguishable from stone. She learned the woman's name by accident, in the way the important things are always learned. It was the second week of her service, and she had gone into the sealed room to dust as she was bidden, and she had knelt to clean the low shelf beneath the window, where a work-basket sat exactly as its owner had left it, a half-finished piece of embroidery still stretched on its frame, the needle threaded, the thread pale green to match a gown. Beneath the basket, fallen or placed, was a letter. Nora did not read it. She was not a girl who read other people's letters, whatever the house believed a chambermaid to be. The letter, though, had fallen face up, and the direction was written in a firm hand, and it said, "To my dear Lady Eleanor." And below, in the same hand, a single line she could not help but see before she looked away. "You must not blame yourself for what you could not have known. Lady Eleanor." Nora set the work-basket down as she had found it, needle and thread and half a rose worked in pale green, and she left the letter where it lay, and she carried the name out of the room the way one carries water in cupped hands, spilling none of it. Lady Eleanor, who had worn the staggering in a pale green gown, and who was smiling in her portrait at something outside the frame, and who was gone so completely that the house had built a wall of years around the fact of her. A woman came to Ashcombe that same week who was not gone at all, and who intended that everyone should know it. Lady Margaret Hartwell, the Dowager Countess, the Earl's aunt by marriage, and the nearest thing the house had to a mistress, arrived in a carriage with 4 horses and a maid of her own, and the settled certainty of a woman who has never once been asked to leave her room. She was handsome, still at 60, silver-haired, straight-backed, her gloves the color of fresh cream, and she surveyed the hall on her arrival as a general surveys a field. He means to take. Nora, carrying linen down the back stairs, saw her through the balustrade and knew at once, the way one knows weather, that this was a person who would decide things. The Dowager decided things. Within a day, the household ran to her clock. Within 3, she had opinions on the coffee, the candles, the cut of the underfootman's livery, and the girl on the stairs. Nora heard the last from the housekeeper, who repeated it without malice, only weariness. "Her ladyship asks who the new maid is," the housekeeper said, "and I have told her, and she says a house in mourning has no need of fresh faces, and that you have a look about you she does not care for." Nora said that she was sorry to give offense. The housekeeper said that giving offense to the Dowager was as easy as breathing, and about as avoidable, and that Nora should keep to the back stairs and out of the way. Nora kept to the back stairs. The Dowager, however, had a way of appearing where the back stairs led out, and she looked at Nora each time with the particular attention a woman gives a stain she means to remove. The Dowager had come. Nora gathered from the talk in the kitchen to end the 11 years. She had come to open the east wing and let in the light and marry her nephew to a living woman before the family name died with him in that cold gallery. There was a young lady in view, a Miss Cassandra Vane, the daughter of a viscount, 25 and unmarried by choice, rather than misfortune, with a fortune of her own and a face the season had admired for 3 years running. The Dowager spoke of Miss Vane, the way she spoke of everything, as a matter already settled, that merely awaited the formality of happening. And the house, hearing her, began to believe that the drawn curtains might come down at last, and did not stop to wonder what the Earl believed, because no one asked the Earl anything, least of all the Earl himself. Nora, dusting the sealed room, found herself standing longer before the portrait than her work required. She told herself it was the light. In truth, it was the smile. Lady Eleanor smiled at something the painter had placed outside the frame, and the smile was not the arranged smile of a sitter, but the caught smile of a woman who has just been told something that pleased her. And Nora, who had smiled that way once at her father across a supper table, felt the 11 years in the room press against her chest like a hand. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of that as well. She wiped the frame and swept the cold hearth and left, and she did not tell herself she would think of the portrait, and she thought of it all the rest of the day. The first time the Earl spoke to her, it was to give a command, and she mistook it, as she mistook all his commands after, for coldness. She had been carrying coal up the servants' stair when the scuttle slipped, and half its weight went down the steps, and she had knelt to gather it. In the dark, her hands black with it, when a shadow fell across her and a voice above her said, "Level and low, leave it." She looked up. The Earl stood on the stair above her, and he was not looking at the coal but at her hands, which were bleeding a little where the scuttle's edge had caught them. And he said again, "Leave it. Someone else will see to that." Then he was gone up the stair, and Nora knelt among the spilled coal with her bleeding hands, and burned with a shame she could not name, because she had been told to leave her work, and a chambermaid who leaves her work is a chambermaid on her way out the door. She did not understand, that night, that the man had seen her hands before he had seen the coal. She understood only the order, and the order was cold, and she folded it small and put it away. The dowager's plan gathered speed like a stone rolling downhill. A dinner was arranged. Miss Vane would come, and her father, the Viscount, and a handful of the county's better families, and the Earl would sit at the head of his own table for the first time in 11 years, and look at a living woman across the candles, and the county would understand that Ashcombe had rejoined the world. The house threw itself into the work of it. The great dining room, shut nearly as long as the east wing, was opened and aired and polished. And Nora, because she was strong and quiet and cheap, was sent to help with the heavy cleaning. And so she came to spend her days in the two closed rooms of the house, the dining room that was being opened for the living and the sealed room that was kept for the dead. And she moved between them like a needle-drawing thread through two halves of a torn thing. It was in the dining room on a high ladder, washing the crystal drops of the chandelier one by one, that she overheard the dowager for the second time. Lady Margaret had come to inspect the progress, and had brought Miss Vane's likeness, a small painted miniature she meant to show her nephew. And she stood below the ladder discussing it with the housekeeper, as though Nora, 10 feet above her, were a piece of the furniture. "She will do very well," the dowager said, "once the girl above us has finished making the place fit to be seen. And then, lower, though not so low that a chandelier could not hear it, we shall have that maudlin room across the hall shut up properly at last, and the portrait taken down, and no more of this unwholesome brooding over a woman 11 years cold. A house cannot mourn forever. It is not decent." Nora on the ladder held a crystal drop very still in her fingers and did not let it fall. That night she went into the sealed room without her cloth, without her broom, only her candle, and she stood before the portrait of Lady Eleanor, and she said aloud, "In the empty room they mean to take you down." The painted woman smiled at whatever the painter had put outside the frame. Nora had no right to be there without her work in her hands, no right to speak to a dead countess as though the two of them were acquainted, no right to feel the loss of a portrait that was not hers to lose. She felt it anyway. And she understood, standing there, that the ring on the Earl's hand and the ring on the portrait's hand were the same ring, and that a man does not wear a dead woman's ring for 11 years because he has forgotten her, and that the coldness the house complained of was not the absence of feeling, but its opposite. Feeling walled up so long it had gone dark for want of air. The Earl found her there. She heard the door and turned with her heart in her throat, and he was standing in the doorway with a branch of candles in his hand, and his face, when the light reached it, was not angry. It was undone. He looked at the girl standing before his wife's portrait, as though she were a thing he had lost and not expected to find. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the 11 years stood in the room with them like a third person. Then he said very low, "You were not to come here without work to do." And Nora, who should have begged his pardon and fled, heard herself say instead, "They mean to take her down, my lord." The silence after that was long. The candle flames leaned and steadied. The Earl crossed the room, not to Nora, but to the portrait, and he stood before it with his back to the girl. And Nora watched his shoulders, which were the shoulders of a man holding a great weight and pretending it was nothing, and she saw the exact moment the pretending failed. It failed silently. It failed only in the way his head bowed the smallest degree, in the way his gloved hand rose to the frame and stopped short of touching it. "My aunt," he said at last, "believes a house cannot mourn forever." He did not turn around. Nora said nothing. "Perhaps she is right," he said. "It is my house, though." He turned then, and looked at Nora as though seeing her for the first time not as a chambermaid, but as a person who had spoken a true thing in a room built of untrue silences. And he asked her name. "Nora Pruitt, my lord," she said. "Pruitt," he repeated, as though filing it somewhere. "And you were the schoolmaster's daughter up at Kelby, before the fever." It was not a question. Nora's breath caught, because she had told no one at Ashcombe who her father had come here precisely to be no one's daughter. And the Earl saw the catch and said, "I make it my business to know who comes into my house." Then, more quietly, "Your father taught my steward's boys their letters. He was a good man. I was sorry to hear of it." And Nora, who had not heard her father called a good man by anyone in 4 years, stood in the sealed room and could not speak. "You may go," the Earl said. It was not the cold dismissal the house would have expected. It was, Nora understood only later, a mercy, a way of ending a moment that had gone too deep for either of them to stand in a breath longer. She went. And that night, lying in her narrow bed under the eaves, she understood that she had seen behind the wall, and that a person who has seen behind a wall is changed by the seeing, and that she would carry the Earl's bowed head and stopped hand about with her now like a stone in her pocket, warm from the holding. Here I will ask you to stay with her a while, for the story turns from this point, and the turning is the whole of it. If Nora's quiet has moved you, you might let this small tale go on unbroken to its end. She would have asked no more than that of anyone. The days that followed were strange with the new weather. The Earl did not seek Nora out, and she did not seek him, and yet the house had shifted a degree on its axis, and both of them felt it. She would be at her work in a corridor, and he would pass, and he would not speak, but his step would slow the smallest fraction. And once he stopped and asked whether the cut on her hand had healed, and when she said it had, he looked at the hand a moment as though to confirm it, and then went on. The underfootman, who missed nothing that could be turned into talk, remarked in the kitchen that the master had grown almost civil of late, and wondered what had got into him. Nora scrubbed the pot in her hands and said she was sure she did not know. She knew. She knew the way the body knows, before the mind consents, and she was ashamed of the knowing, because she was a chambermaid, 23, with black beneath her nails, and he was the Earl of Ashcombe, and the distance between them was not a distance that closed. She told herself the warmth she felt when his step slowed was gratitude, only gratitude, that he had spoken well of her father. She told herself this on the back stairs, and in the scullery, and over her bread and her body, which did not lie, answered her each time by turning toward the sound of his voice in a far room the way a plant turns toward a window she could not see. The wound she carried made a liar of her hope. Nora had learned young that she was a person other people set down and walked away from. Her mother had died before memory. Her father, whom she had loved past all sense, had left her nothing but debts and a way of looking at rooms, and the world had made its verdict plain in the 4 years since. In every door that had closed, in every position given to a younger girl or a prettier one or one with people behind her. She had come to Ashcombe to be no one, because being no one was safer than being someone, and finding out again that no one wished to keep you. So when her body turned toward the Earl's voice, her mind stepped in and said, "He is grieving a dead wife, and being kind to a schoolmaster's orphan, and that is all it is. And you will not make it more, because to make it more is to invite the closing of one more door." She threw herself into the sealed room instead. If the dowager meant to take the portrait down, then Nora meant that Lady Eleanor should be cared for to the last. She dusted the frame daily. She cleaned the windows and once, greatly daring, drew the faded curtains back a hand's width to let the morning in, so that for an hour the painted woman was lit as she had not been lit in 11 years, and the pale green of her gown came alive, and the smile at something outside the frame seemed almost to move, Then Nora drew the curtains closed again, because the room was not hers to change, and she carried the image of the lit portrait down the stairs and held it against the gray of her days. It was in the sealed room that she found the second thing. The thing that changed the shape of everything. Behind the workbasket, tucked into the join of the window seat, where the wood had shrunk from the wall, was a folded paper gone soft at the creases with age. And Nora, reaching for a fallen pin, felt it against her fingers and drew it out. She should have left it. She knew. She should have left it. The paper had come half open in her hand, and she saw that it was not a letter but a drawing, a quick pencil sketch of two children, a boy and a girl, heads bent together over a book, and beneath it, in the same firm hand that had written the letter, a caption, "My Julian and his sister the summer before." Nora stood very still. The boy in the sketch had the Earl's brow, unmistakable, drawn young and unguarded. And the woman who had made the sketch, who had kept it in her work-basket, who had signed the letter Lady Eleanor, was not— Nora understood in a rush that stopped her breath. The Earl's wife at all, she was his mother. Nora sat down on the window seat because her legs would not hold her. She looked at the portrait with wholly new eyes. The woman in pale green was not a bride. The Earl had buried and mourned 11 years. She was the mother he had lost as a boy, and the ring he wore was his mother's ring, and the sealed room was not a widower's shrine but a son's, and the coldness of him, the 11 walled-up years, was the grief of a child who had lost the one face in the world that smiled at him the way the painted face smiled at the painter. At something just outside the frame. At him, everything. The house believed was wrong. Everything the dowager meant to shut away as unwholesome brooding over a lost wife was, in truth, a boy's last room with his mother in it. And Nora, who had lost her own father and knew exactly the shape of that particular hole in a person, put her face in her black-nailed hands and wept at last in the one room in the house where no one would ever come to see. How? The dowager, meanwhile, had grown impatient. The dinner was upon them. Miss Cassandra Vane arrived 2 days before, installed in the best guest chamber, and she was everything the season had promised, tall and fair and gowned in ice-blue silk. With a laugh she deployed like a fan, and a way of looking through servants that was so complete it had no cruelty in it at all, only absence. She was not unkind. She was simply certain, as the dowager was certain, that the world was arranged for her convenience, and she moved through Ashcombe as through a house already half hers. Nora, carrying Miss Vane's water, and Miss Vane's linen, and Miss Vane's endless changes of gown, watched her with no envy and a strange pity, because Miss Vane was to be married to a man whose whole heart was walled up in a room she would never be given the key to, and she did not know it. The dowager told Nora, in effect, on the morning of the dinner, though she did not mean to tell her anything. Lady Margaret had come to the sealed room herself, the first time she had crossed its threshold, and she found Nora there with her cloth, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the portrait of Lady Eleanor with an expression Nora could not at first read. It was not grief. It was something more like old irritation, the face of a woman looking at a rival long dead, who has still somehow contrived to win. "Take it down after the dinner," the dowager said to Nora, as though Nora were the one who had raised it. "Wrap it and put it in the attic with the rest of her things. My nephew has grieved his mother 11 years, and it has made him unfit for the living. It is past time." And Nora, cloth in hand, heard the word mother fall from the dowager's own mouth, and knew that the dowager had always known, that the whole house had once known, and that only the passing of years and servants had let the truth curdle into the convenient lie of a mourned wife, which was easier to end than a mourned mother, because a wife may be replaced, and a mother may not. "You knew," Nora said. She should not have said it. A chambermaid does not say "you knew" to a dowager countess. It was out now, and the dowager turned her cold, clear eyes on the girl, and said, "I know a great many things, and one of them is that a house run on sentiment is a house run into the ground." His mother indulged him past all sense, and then had the poor taste to die, and leave me the managing of what she spoiled. Take the portrait down. That was the third time Nora heard the family's grief dismissed, and it was the cruelest, because it was spoken not in gossip, nor in general, but directly, over the very face it meant to consign to the attic. And Nora looked at the smiling painted woman and made a decision she had no standing to make. She would not take the portrait down. The dinner that evening was the grandest thing Ashcombe had seen in a decade. The great dining room blazed with the candles Nora had washed, drop by drop. The long table gleamed. 30 covers were laid, and the county came in its silks and its jewels, and the dowager sat in triumph near the head, and Miss Cassandra Vane sat in ice blue at the Earl's right hand, and the Earl sat at the head of his own table for the first time in 11 years, with a face like carved stone. Nora was among the servants who carried and poured invisible in the black and white of her station, and she watched the Earl over the shoulders of the guests, and she saw that he was not present at his own dinner at all, that his body sat at the table and the rest of him was across the hall in a sealed room, glass in hand, to make the announcement she had orchestrated the whole evening to hold. Lady Margaret's voice carried down the table like a bell. She spoke of new beginnings, of the healing of time, of the joy it gave her to see her nephew restored to the world. And she said that she was certain the whole company would wish to be the first to congratulate the Earl of Ashcombe and Miss Cassandra Vane on an understanding that would, she trusted, be very soon and very happily concluded. The table rustled into its murmur of pleasure. Glasses lifted. Miss Vane inclined her fair head with the practiced grace of a woman accepting what is owed her. And the Earl of Ashcombe sat with his hand around a glass he did not raise, and looked at nothing, and said nothing, and the not saying stretched until the table's murmur faltered, and the candles seemed to burn louder in the quiet. It was into that quiet that the folly happened, the small cruelty, that undid the evening. Miss Vane, to fill the silence her intended would not fill, turned a bright social remark toward the dowager, something light about the dreary old rooms of great houses, and how she looked forward to opening every last one of them to the air, and the dowager, pleased, replied that they would begin with the worst of them, which had been kept these 11 years as a shrine to sentiment, and would make, she thought, a charming morning room once its gloomy portrait was got rid of. And someone laughed. And Nora, standing against the wall with a wine jug in her hand, saw the Earl's face, at last come present, saw the stone crack straight through, and understood that the room the whole table was laughing at was the last place on earth his mother's smile still hung. He rose. He did not rise in anger, or not only in anger. He rose the way a man rises who has finally understood that silence has cost him everything and will cost him more. The table fell quiet. The dowager's smile held uncertain, and the Earl of Ashcombe looked down the length of his own table, past the silks and the jewels and the lifted glasses, and his eyes found against the far wall the plain gray figure of the chambermaid with the wine jug, the one person in the room who knew what the laughter was laughing at, and he held her gaze for the length of one breath. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and level, and it reached every corner of the silent room. That room is my mother's. It stays. 4 words of it, and the rest. And the table did not breathe. It was not a declaration of love. It was a declaration of truth. And it did the work that no declaration of love could have done, because it named the thing the house had lied about for 11 years, and set it upright in front of 30 witnesses. The dowager's face, Nora saw, went through its changes quickly. The certainty first, then the calculation. Then, as she understood that her nephew had corrected her, not in private, but before the entire county, before the Vanes, before the world whose opinion was the only currency she trafficked in. A slow collapse of the polished surface into something older and more human. A woman who has just discovered that the script that has worked everywhere has failed. Here at last, she did not speak. She sat. Miss Vane, to her credit, understood more quickly than the dowager, and better. She looked at the Earl, and then she followed the Earl's glance to the gray figure against the wall, and something in her fair, certain face resolved into a rueful, almost relieved comprehension. The look of a woman who has just been released from a bargain she had not known was a cage. She lifted her own glass then, and into the ringing silence she said lightly, gracefully giving the Earl the thing he had not asked for, and needed most. "Then let us drink to your mother, my lord, and to the room that keeps her." And she drank. And the county, which follows a lead the way water follows a channel, drank with her, and the moment that might have been a scandal became instead a thing the county would tell for years. The night the cold Earl of Ashcombe spoke of his mother at last, and the beautiful Miss Vane raised the first glass to her. Nora set down the wine jug because her hands were shaking too much to hold it. She slipped from the room in the confusion of the toast, out into the cold hall, across to the double doors of the east wing, and she let herself into the sealed room with the key at her waist, and she stood before the portrait in the dark, and she said, "He told them." She was still standing there when the door opened behind her and the Earl came in with a branch of candles, as he had come once before, and this time he did not tell her she had no work to do there. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching her, both of them facing the painted woman in pale green, and for a long moment the only sound was the small stir of the candle flames. "You found it out," he said at last. He was not asking the sketch. "I suppose I could never bring myself to move it." Nora said that she had not meant to pry. He said that he knew she had not, that she was the only person who had entered that room in 11 years, and left it more cared for than she found it, and that he had known it each morning by the clean hearth and the dustless frame, and had not let himself wonder too closely who was tending his mother while he could not. "My aunt thinks it madness," he said. "Perhaps it is. She died when I was 9. There was a fever in the county, the same, I think, that later took your father, and she went into the cottages to nurse the sick against every advice, and she brought it home, and she died of it in 3 days, and the last thing she said to me was that I was not to blame myself for what I could not have known." He was quiet a moment. "It was in the letter," he said. "You will have seen the letter." Nora had seen it. "To my dear Lady Eleanor," she said softly, and he shook his head and told her the letter was one his mother had written and never sent to a friend also nursing the sick, and that the line about blame was one Lady Eleanor had meant for the friend, and that he had taken for himself, at 9 years old, and kept for 23 years, because a boy will take any words spoken near his grief and make them the whole of it. "I have blamed myself every day of my life," he said, level and low, "that I did not stop her at the door. I was 9. I could not have stopped her. I have known that with my mind. For a long time, I have never once known it here." And he touched at last the frame of the portrait, his gloved fingers coming to rest against the gilded wood. The first time Nora had seen him complete the gesture he had twice begun, she did not tell him it was not his fault. She knew better than anyone in the world that being told is not the same as being believed, that the mind may hold a truth for decades while the heart refuses it entrance. Instead, she told him the one thing she did know, standing in the cold room with the woman who had smiled at her son from the far wall for 23 years. She would not want the room kept as a grave, Nora said. "Look at her. She is not grieving. In that portrait, she is smiling at you. A woman who smiled at you like that would not want to be the reason you never smiled again." The Earl of Ashcombe turned from the portrait and looked at the chambermaid, and something moved in his still face that Nora had not seen there before, not in the gallery, nor on the stair, nor in this room, a warmth so long unused it seemed almost to hurt him. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her given name, and he said it the way a man says a word he has been saving. "You have a way of seeing what a room is hiding." Nora said that her father had taught her that. The Earl said that her father had taught her well. And then he said, more quietly, "I find I do not wish you to go back to the scrubbing of grates." And Nora, whose whole life had been a series of doors closing, stood very still before a door she could hear beginning impossibly to open, and did not yet dare to walk through it. She did not walk through it that night. There were things between them that a single evening could not resolve, the distance of station chief among them, and Nora had lived too long with closing doors to trust an opening one before she had watched it a while. She went back to her narrow bed under the eaves. In the days that followed, the house changed around her in ways that could not be hidden. The curtains of the sealed room came down not to shut the portrait in the attic but to let the light in, and the room that had been a grave became, by the Earl's own order, a mourning room after all, though not the dowager's kind, for the portrait stayed on its wall above the hearth, and now a fire was lit beneath it. And Lady Eleanor smiled down at last on a room that was warm. The dowager left within the week. She left with her dignity gathered around her like her cream-colored gloves. And she said little, but on the morning of her going, she stopped Nora in the hall, and she looked at the girl a long moment, and she said, "You have done a thing I could not do in 11 years." Then she was gone, corrected rather than crushed, displaced rather than destroyed, and the house exhaled after her carriage like a man loosening a collar, worn too tight, too long. Miss Cassandra Vane had gone the day after the dinner, released, and Nora thought glad of it, and word came later in the season that she had made a match of her own choosing to a man who laughed as readily as she did, and Dora was glad of that too. By Christmas the east wing was open all through, and the fires were lit, and the schoolmaster's daughter was no longer a chambermaid. What she was instead was not yet a thing the county had words for, and the Earl was in no hurry to give it words before Nora was ready to hear them, for he had learned, in a cold room over 11 silent years, the cost of the things left unsaid, and he did not mean to repeat it. He courted her slowly and in the open, as a man courts a woman he means to keep, and is not ashamed to be seen keeping, and the county, which had drunk to his mother at his word, found that it could drink to a schoolmaster's daughter too, if the Earl of Ashcombe asked it to. On the last evening of the old year, Nora stood in the morning room, that had been the sealed room, and the fire was warm on the hearth beneath the portrait, and the Earl came and stood beside her, and they looked up together at the woman in pale green who smiled at something just outside the frame. Nora had understood, weeks before, what it was the painted woman smiled at, and she understood it more surely now, standing where the painter must have stood, in the place from which the whole of Lady Eleanor's happiness looked out. On the mantel below the portrait, where the work-basket had once sat with its half-worked rose, Nora had set a small thing of her own, the only thing of her father's she had carried out of Kelby, a plain pencil worn short, the one he had used to teach her letters, and to show her how to look at a room until it gave up what it hid. The Earl saw where her eyes had gone, and he took her hand, the one with the healed cut, and he did not speak, and neither did she. Outside the tall windows the first snow of the year had begun to fall, slow and without wind, settling white on the gray stone of the old house. And inside the fire ticked, and the two portraits above the hearth, the painted mother and the living son, wore the same small caught smile, turned toward the same thing just outside the frame. Nora Pruitt, who had come to Ashcombe to be no one, and who had found instead a room full of someone else's grief, and stayed to tend it until the grief let go, stood in the firelight with her hand in his, and was, for the first time in her life, kept. The snow went on falling. The short pencil rested on the warm mantel where her father would have been glad to see it, and Lady Eleanor smiled down at all of them, at last, in the light. If Nora's story has stayed with you, you might carry her quiet a little way into your own evening. She would have liked that, I think, better than any louder thing.